Good morning. And thank you for this opportunity to preach on Goshen College's homecoming weekend. We are at CMC, we are in a fall series on the ancient stories from the book of Genesis. And just to remind us all, these stories took place around 3,000 years ago, 1,000 years before Christ, or the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob part of this. This morning, we move on to the story of Joseph, the son of Jacob, and his reconciliation with his brothers. It's a wonderfully complex and emotional story, and there's so much detail here that I've had to condense a lot. And even though this text assigned to me provides biblical evidence that Goshen is a land of plenty, I'm going to refrain from any presidential rhetoric on that today. And just to remind the CMCers that the last story we heard in our Genesis series was from Talasha, when the young Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery. And in that story, Joseph might have been 15 to 17 years old. And at the point that I'm picking up the story, Joseph was probably in his 30s. Now, I've selected a few images to illustrate this story, so I want to take a few moments to set the stage and introduce you to the main characters. First, Joseph. A talented, charismatic, handsome, favorite son. He behaved in ways that made his brothers insanely jealous. And he lands in Egypt as a slave and a foreigner in exile. Through his cleverness and competence, he achieves an incredible ascendance in Egypt. Joseph is now in charge of the Pharaoh's household and ruler of all Egypt. And yet, he is still an immigrant. Justo Gonzalez, a theologian and author of the book Santa Biblia, the Bible through Hispanic eyes, is a Cuban American. And he points out that Joseph was a Hebrew Egyptian. Gonzalez commented about Joseph, "We exiles have come to the center, yet we remain in the periphery. In a way, we no longer know where the center is, for that is the very nature of exile, a life in which one is forced to revolve around a center that is not one's own, and that in many ways one does not wish to own. Exile is a dislocation of the center with all the ambiguities and ambivalence of such dislocation." So as you listen to this story, remember that Joseph has a hyphenated identity. He is a Hebrew Egyptian and a man with unresolved anger and trauma. Next is Judah, the second son of Jacob's first wife, Leah. It was Judah's idea to sell Joseph, rather than to simply abandon him in the pit. In the chapters of Genesis that we are skipping over, Judah suffers loss, learns from his mistakes, and acquires humility and wisdom. Judah was significantly older than Joseph and has lived a harder life. And this is the patriarch Jacob, also named Israel, the father of a disintegrated family running out of food in the land of Canaan. He is wealthy, but when there's no food, your money does you no good. As the famine becomes severe, Jacob sends his sons to Egypt with money to buy corn. But favoritism is still at play. Jacob holds back Benjamin, his remaining favorite son of his favorite wife, Rachel. So the story begins at a food distribution site. This is not an ancient scene. These go on all around the world today. This photo was taken last year at a food distribution site in Palestine. These places are typically crowded, dirty, sweaty, and tense. Officials are trying to maintain order and prevent theft. Joseph is such an official. And in the midst of that hard work, Joseph recognizes a group of men as his family, his brothers. What a moment. We can only imagine the emotions surging through Joseph's body. Joseph does not reveal his identity. He harshly accuses them of being spies. And as they scramble to defend themselves, they describe their family in ways that confirm that indeed they are his brothers, the sons of his own father, Jacob, the ones who threw him into a pit and sold him into slavery. Joseph throws them into jail. Was this out of anger and a desire for revenge? Maybe. Did he do this because he wanted to buy some time, work through his emotions, and consider the possibilities? Maybe. Joseph had tried until now to blot out his family past. He named his firstborn son Manasseh, which means to forget. In Genesis 41, Joseph explains the name, "For God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's house." And now suddenly he is forced to remember. After a few days, when he meets with them again, he has figured out his approach. He will sell them grain to feed their families, but he demands that they bring him back their youngest brother, Benjamin, Joseph's only brother from his same mother, Rachel. Favoritism is a really strong thread in this family system. He proposes to keep Simeon as a hostage until they bring him Benjamin. The brothers talk in Hebrew, assuming Joseph the Egyptian cannot understand. After all, he has kept up his Egyptian persona and is speaking to them in Egyptian through a translator. The brothers start to argue. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen." Joseph turned away from them and began to weep. When he regained control of himself, Joseph took their money and sold them the corn they needed. He had Simeon taken from them and bound him in front of their eyes. Then Joseph plays his next trick. He puts the coins back into the sacks of corn carried home by the brothers. Now, trickiness or deceit is also a strong thread in this family system. When they discover the money back in their sacks, the brothers are terrified. They believe they have been framed and that Joseph will send soldiers to arrest and punish them. But they continue home to Canaan and tell their story to Jacob. The man in Egypt wants them to come back with Benjamin. But Jacob wants to protect what he has left of his family. He refuses to send Benjamin. Time passes, and the famine becomes even more severe in the land. Jacob is forced to send the brothers again to Egypt for corn, but he still does not want to release Benjamin. The family argues and negotiates, trying to find a solution, given Jacob's fierce attachment to Benjamin and their need for food for survival. Judah emerges as the leader. Judah says to his father, "Send the boy along with me, and we will go at once, so that we and you and our children may live and not die. I myself will guarantee his safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him. As it is, if we had not delayed, we could have gone and returned twice." Then their father Israel said to them, "If it must be, then do this. Take gifts to the man. Take double the amount of silver with you, for you must return the silver that was put back into the mouths of your sacks. And take Benjamin also. And may God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, so that he will let Simeon and Benjamin come back with you. As for me, If I am bereaved, I am bereaved." And so the brothers returned to Egypt. They presented to Joseph the gifts they had brought, and they bowed down before him to the ground. Remember, they thought they were going to be arrested. Joseph asked them how they were, and then he said, "How is your aged father you told me about? Is he still living?" They replied, "He is still alive and well." As Joseph looked about and saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, "Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about?" Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room, and he wept there. After he had washed his face, he came out, and controlling himself, served his brothers an elaborate meal and gave Benjamin the largest portions. After this meal, Joseph sold the brothers the grain they needed, and they prepared to travel home to Canaan, reunited with Simeon. Now Joseph plays another trick. He plants his silver chalice in Benjamin's sack, and then sends his steward to confront the brothers about the missing chalice. One by one, from the oldest to the youngest, the brothers open their grain sacks to prove that they did not steal the chalice. But when Benjamin opens his sack, there it is. The steward demands that Benjamin return to Egypt with the chalice. Judah again emerges as the leader. He leads the brothers back to Egypt and offers that all of them will stay as slaves of Joseph. But Joseph insists that he wants only Benjamin. Judah steps forward again, making a heartfelt appeal on behalf of their father. Judah says, "Our father said to us, 'You know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One of them went away from me and surely has been torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to you, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in misery. If that boy is not with me when I go back to my father, he will die. I guaranteed to my father, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Please," Judah says to Joseph, "keep me here as your slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father." The appeal worked. Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he asked that all his Egyptian colleagues leave. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. And now, finally, Joseph speaks to them in their mother tongue of Hebrew. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother, Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will be destitute. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly.' Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. That's all the storytellers give us. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. I wonder what they said. There must have been so much to say amongst these 12 brothers. Too much to say just then. There is more reconciliation work within this family that happens later in the chapters of Genesis, but it was a beginning. The brothers returned again to their father Jacob. They told him all that had happened, and the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, "I'm convinced. My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." So Jacob and all his offspring went to Egypt, taking with them their livestock and every movable possession they owned. What a risk Jacob takes. An old man who is leaving all he has known for a future in a foreign land that might make the family whole again. On the journey, God appears. It is the only time that God speaks in the whole Joseph saga. God spoke to Israel in a vision at night. God said, "Jacob, Jacob." "Here I am," he replied. "I am God, the God of your father," he said. "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again." Joseph went to Goshen to meet his father, along with the whole clan. As soon as Joseph saw Jacob, Joseph threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. These are the stories of our spiritual ancestors. The setting is far away and long ago, but the story is also familiar because many of us have been affected by dislocation or estrangement or trauma, directly or through our family systems. Many of us have also moved back and forth across boundaries, struggling for food or survival or wholeness. Perhaps this ancient story is not so far away after all. Inside us, the past, present, and future happening at once, we are found this way, together, a people spliced by empire, wrote the poet Giovanni Rosa in a poem this year in 2023 about the Puerto Rican experience in America. So, what can we learn from the story of Joseph? Well, we learn that the people of God 3,000 years ago and in the present are a people spliced by empire. We here at CMC received into membership last Sunday many people who have moved across borders experiencing dislocation or estrangement or trauma. Our congregation is also a people spliced by empire. Reconciliation is an expression of God's heart. Reconnection, to be made whole, is what we most deeply desire, and it is what God desires for us. God designed us for relationship. We are made for this. But reconciliation is not easy. It takes time, with disorienting twists and turns. Perhaps disorientation is necessary. And this story dishes out a big dose of humility. We usually don't know what will happen or on what timetable. Is reconciliation possible or not? We can act in ways that make reconciliation possible, but we cannot control the process. We learn that God's people are imperfect. Young Judah was the one that suggested they at least get some silver for Joseph after throwing him into the pit. And the young Joseph was talented, but he was arrogant. He enjoyed his father's favoritism, and he tattled on his brothers. We want our ancestors to have been good through and through. But these stories don't pretend that God's people possess a stream of innocence that finally wins in the end. God does not seem to need perfect people. And people change. Judah becomes a truth teller. He reminds Jacob and Joseph about what is really important and prevents both of them from making bad decisions. Judah's clear-headed, persuasive speeches change the course of this story more than once. And Joseph, talented, tricky Joseph, is finally present to his own anger and grief. He weeps and weeps and weeps and weeps again in this story. There's 5 instances of Joseph weeping in this narrative. And when needed, he exhibits self-control. He listens to Judah's good counsel. And in the end, he's generous to the brothers who had abused him as a teenager. We learn that families are sources of great hurt as well as great healing. As children, we learn about the love of God first and foremost through our families. And knowing just how flawed families can be makes that a scary proposition. Love in families can become twisted in bizarre ways, as we have witnessed in the stories of Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Esau, and Joseph and his brothers. But love also has the power to draw us back together. Finally, Joseph himself interprets these events as God working for good, the good of Egyptians and Hebrews alike. This story invites us to entertain the possibility that God is at work right now, actively in our lives and contexts, even in our mistakes, creating opportunities for torn relationships to be mended if we too are present to our anger and grief, realize that relationships really matter, and practice self-control. We will weep. God's only promise in this story is God's message in the night to Jacob that God will go with us to Egypt, to the places of our brokenness, wherever our Egypts may be. Called or uncalled, God is there. Known or unknown, God is there. Seen or unseen, God is there.